Having left the advertising agency and still not being too sure what I wanted to do, I remembered Argentina. I remember my dad and his best friend, who was a guy called Alan Campbell, who ran EMI out there and used to give Dad free records. And so, in a hunch that EMI might need someone who'd been in advertising, I rang EMI, spoke to Miss Nifosi, head of personnel at EMI Records, and she said, absolutely not, we don't need anyone like you at all. And sent me a rejection letter, which I framed and had up there. Every managing directorship I had at EMI thereafter, it was hanging proudly on the wall. I think she got to find out about this and never really liked me. And she turned me down, but I suddenly had a hunch and looked in the EMI, or I looked in the phone book, the main phone book, and discovered that EMI had 2 addresses and 2 phones. And on the second address and phone was the company at Hayes, Middlesex, where the overseas division was sited. And within days I was given an interview. It was a perfunctory interview. They established I could speak Spanish, and once they'd done that, they actually sent me down to Miss Nifosi the following day for a formal interview in order to start my traineeship on the graduate trainee scheme, as it was then called, at EMI Records in London, Manchester Square. And the funny thing about this story is that many years later, about 16 years later, when I was back at Manchester Square as managing director of EMI Records, Miss Nifosi was still the personnel, or as they say, personnel director, HR. And halfway through my first year as MD, she called me down one day, or she didn't call me down, sorry, I called her up. And we sat reviewing that year's intake for the graduate trainee scheme. And I looked down the list, her short list of recommendations. And then I didn't like any of them, so I asked for the full list, and so she gave me the full list. And there was one guy in it that looked really good, and I thought, yeah, he'll be worth a go. And she said, well, we can't have him. And I said, why not? And she said, well, because he's not a graduate. And I said, well, yeah, we'll make an exception. She said, no, we have never made an exception. The graduate trainee scheme is for graduates. We have never had anybody through this scheme who isn't a graduate. And I said, well, actually, me. And she said, no, you were a graduate because otherwise you wouldn't have been on the scheme. And I said, no, look, I know something about myself. I didn't go to university. She said, well, you must have. You must have. And I said, I was lost for words. And she said, I will call for archive. I will call for archive and recover your original CV and details. So she, about 2 weeks later, came back into my office triumphantly and said, look, here you are. Here's your original CV presented at the point of interview. It shows you're a graduate. So I looked down the education list on my original CV, and halfway along it, it said St. George's College BA. And she said, there you are, Bachelor of Arts. And I said, actually, that's St. George's College, Buenos Aires. BA is Buenos Aires. And she said, and I said, it's just a secondary school. And she said, good God, do you mean to say you weren't a graduate? And I said, no. She said, well, we'd never have let you in if we'd known that.